I absolutely love mountains. Ironically, I live in what's perhaps the flattest country on God's green earth. I guess we crave what we don't have. One of my biggest passions in life is hiking and exploring the rich landscapes the planet has to offer. For me, nothing beats sitting at a campfire on a remote mountaintop and gazing up at the stars after a long day of intense walking and climbing, only to wake up the next day to find your tent being ravaged by a group of angry German cows. I try to plan at least 1 or 2 hiking trips abroad annually if it fits my work schedule and budget. And depending on the mercy of the Dutch weather god of, guess what, it just might not rain today, I try to go on as many small day hikes as I can right here at home. But in the meantime, I have to stay patient and wait for the next big trip. Luckily, in the meantime, we have this thing called video games, which let you live out your own fantasies and adventures from the comfort of your own home. Now, despite growing up in the early 90s, I never actually experienced the Zelda game up until Ocarina of Time. I vaguely remember seeing one of my neighbor's kids playing A Link to the Past and thinking, this looks neat, but I never played it until way later. Ocarina of Time is the game that sparked my love for the franchise, and, well, looking at the sales numbers, I'm guessing I wasn't the only one. As a kid, I didn't exactly get hyped for games. They would simply magically appear on my path, either from word of mouth, making a random pick at the video store, or playing it at a friend's house. You would think that when Majora's Mask was announced, the sequel to one of my favorite games, I would know about it as soon as the word hit the streets, but actually, no. After I finished the game, I would simply set it aside, or replay it 30 more times, and then go out and play in the woods with my Master Stick to slay imaginary monsters. I didn't follow any gaming news, barely read any magazines, and the internet was, well... So by the time Majora's Mask released, instead of grabbing a sleeping bag and camping in front of the store to get my copy of the game at launch, my experience went a little more like, hey, what do you got there? Oh, this? It's a new Zelda game. Remember Ocarina of Time? I think this is like the sequel to it or something. Oh, cool. Let's play it. I didn't even own Majora's Mask on the N64 myself, and I don't think I ever did. I would simply go over to my cousin's house daily to play it with him, and after finishing it together, I borrowed it a couple of times after, and it grew out to become one of my favorite games. It wasn't until my teenage years when I first started getting hyped for games long before they released. The first games to do so were Mario Sunshine and the Windwaker, to a point where I was constantly buying magazines, downloading trailer and gameplay footage, and at that age, even waiting for half a year for a game to finally drop felt like an eternity. And then of course we had the Twilight Princess reveal. Need I say more? So what does all this nostalgic rambling have to do with Breath of the Wild? Well, up until my early to mid-20s, I enjoyed many different games and even branched out to other platforms. I played games like Half-Life, Fallout, Counter-Strike, Silent Hill, among many others. But then something happened. It was like hitting a brick wall all of a sudden. I stopped enjoying video games. This was horrible timing for me as Skyward Sword just came out. And trust me when I say I tried. I really tried, but I just couldn't get through it. To this day, I have never played past the 3rd dungeon myself. Of course, nowadays, getting wrapped up in Zelda theories and editing videos, I had to do research and learn about the story and lore found in the game. Now, this is by no means meant to be a bash on Skyward Sword. I know there's plenty of people who thoroughly enjoyed this game. This is purely a personal thing. Skyward Sword, to me, represents the time when I started to realize my enjoyment of video games was starting to fade. And this wasn't unique to this game either. Around this time, I sold most of my games and consoles, something I regret to this day, by the way, and I rarely played any video games from that point on. I started focusing on other stuff like work and other hobbies, as I couldn't exactly force myself to like something I clearly lost interest in. This state of mind persevered for a few years. And then 2014 came along. Now, obviously, I didn't immediately go back to being a full-blown gamer right away, but there was this tiny little spark that ignited within me, and then it stayed mostly quiet for 2 years. But secretly, I kept peeking into Breath of the Wild news now and again. I discovered the footage of the 2015 Game Awards presentation with Aonuma and Miyamoto, and then of course we finally got the first proper trailer in 2016. And with that little spark grew into a blaze that almost burned my apartment down. As soon as I saw those gorgeous landscapes, climbing mechanics, cooking, and general theme of survival and non-linearity, I knew that this was gonna be a game changer. To pass the time between the trailer and the release in 2017, I picked up Fallout 4, which was already out for 2 years, but I never bothered to pick it up. And when Breath of the Wild finally came out, I did something I hadn't done in many, many years. I took 2 weeks off of work, closed myself off from society, and allowed myself to be totally immersed into the world of Hyrule. So what do I think of the game overall? Does it have any flaws? Of course it does, no game is perfect. And it doesn't have to be. Ocarina of Time had flaws, and to this day it's regarded as one of the finest achievements in gaming. As a matter of fact, milestones usually are flawed, because they dive into unknown territory. See, when I play a game, I don't play it through the eyes of a critic. I can very easily shut that part of my brain off and simply enjoy what is laid out in front of me, instead of thinking, wow, my sword broke already? Man, weapons are way too brittle. This was a poor decision made by Nintendo. I just adapt to it and think to myself, okay, weapons don't last very long. I'd better make sure to always have a decent stock of different weapons on me, and just move on with my adventure. The part where I start analyzing the game and picking apart its flaws and shortcomings doesn't come until way after I already completed the game. Actually, I would probably be the worst critic in the world in that regard. If my job was to form an opinion, write an article, and give a game a rating right upon release, my reviews would mostly consist of very generous scores. As you can probably deduce from my channel, one of my favorite things in the Zelda series are the dungeons. But instead of thinking, the game is good, but it would have been much better if it had actual dungeons like the previous games, my reasoning would be, the game is amazing despite the fact that it doesn't feature any real dungeons. I could list the things I like or don't like right here, but this isn't meant to be a review. No matter the flaws I can find and pick apart about Breath of the Wild, it doesn't take away that which I enjoy most about the game. The fact that everyone has their own unique adventure with it. It goes back to the old philosophy of the first game on NES, where Miyamoto wanted to incentivize gamers to exchange information, tell their own stories of things they've experienced and discovered, and share strategies between each other. And now, with the technological prowess that is the internet, this is easier than ever. It is exactly what the series needed. The monumental success of Ocarina of Time was both a blessing and a curse for the franchise. On one hand, it launched the series even further into stardom. On the other, it forced Nintendo to stick to a strict formula. Now, I don't want to step on any toes here. I have a huge soft spot for the Windwaker, and I absolutely love Twilight Princess. But can you really blame me when I say that when you take a step back and take a look at the full picture, most games released after Ocarina of Time stayed in that little comfort zone that Ocarina of Time created. And I can't blame Nintendo for it. The big exception amongst the 3D titles released after Ocarina of Time was Majora's Mask. Sure, over the years it's gained a much bigger appreciation and went from a cult classic to a fan favorite. Nowadays it's no longer controversial to say that Majora's Mask is your favorite game. But trust me when I say that when it first released, there were a lot of people who didn't like it. It was weird and confusing, uncomfortable, and what is happening? This is reflected back onto the sales numbers. You would think that a direct sequel to one of the most popular and praised games of all time would sell just as well, if not better. But this wasn't exactly Terminator 2 to the original, not even selling half as many copies as its predecessor. This was a game that tried something very different, and initially it felt like a slap in the face for a lot of the fans of Ocarina. People in general don't take change very well unless it's given in small increments. It's why politics is such a slow process. When a politician gets into office under the name of change, we're not exactly expecting to wake up the next day and everyone is riding pandas to work. On the flip side, as with anything else in life, if you repeat it again and again too often, it inevitably gets stale. By the time Skyward Sword came along, sales numbers had dwindled significantly. You cannot just slap motion controls on a game and expect it to feel like something completely new. You are still doing the same stuff, except instead of pressing a button, you now have to flail your arms around. And again, Skyward Sword isn't to blame for this. It was the inevitable result of reusing the same formula over and over again, and only adding small changes as not to alienate the fanbase too much. Every game following Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask still presented new ideas, but the core of the formula largely stayed the same. Breath of the Wild was the game to finally break the mold and change what we think a Zelda game should be. The series as a whole spans back so far, and it's well on its way to its 4th decade. Just think about that for a moment. 5 years from now, this franchise will exist for 40 years. How many games do you know that are still going strong today after so much time? How many television shows or movie franchises that started in the 80s are still around today and haven't disappeared or degraded in quality? This is a rare phenomenon. And the way Nintendo managed to achieve this is by having that one game, that one milestone that defines a generation. This isn't to say that the games in between these milestones are bad. On the contrary, they're all good. And your favorite game doesn't have to be a milestone. As I stated before, milestones are rarely perfect, because they take bold new leaps into unknown territory. It's much easier to copy something and do it better than to try something completely new and innovative. When people say that Breath of the Wild isn't a masterpiece, I cannot argue against it. In fact, it would be a pointless argument to have, as it's ultimately based on preference. To me, personally, Breath of the Wild is a masterpiece. Not because its brushstrokes are perfect or its composition flawless, but because it dared to do something new and execute it well. I mean, we're still talking about this game, experimenting with it and discovering new things more than 3 years after its release. I'm of the somewhat older generation of Zelda fans, and it's so easy to forget that there are so many young gamers out there whose experience with the series started with Breath of the Wild. In many ways, this is the Ocarina of Time of this new generation. At the same time, I've seen many people my age who grew tired of the series returning with a newfound enthusiasm. And because the game is so dynamic, we all have our own reasons for liking it and our own stories to tell about the adventures we had. For those who did not enjoy Breath of the Wild, I completely understand. Big changes means you're gonna draw in a new crowd, but you're also bound to lose some. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild speaks to me because it reminds me of my hiking trips. I know it's a cliche thing to say, but it's true. Out there, there's no drama, no politics, no internet beef. Just you and that mountaintop you want to reach before nightfall. The game also reminded me that as a 32-year-old man, I can still get totally immersed in a fictional world. And it single-handedly reignited my passion for video games. To me, this proves that childhood nostalgia doesn't always have to dictate your favorite experiences, and you're never too old to get into something new. Modern internet culture has granted levels of hype never before seen, and this devoted fanbase and all these great theorists keeping up the hype with all these creative theories and speculations and storytelling ensures that this franchise is stronger than it's ever been. When we finally get new information about the sequel, we will undoubtedly be in for a wild ride, and I hope you will be there with us when it happens.